I'm live, man. CalisBoxing.com. Go ahead and check out the website. Thanks to all the new subscribers and the followers on Twitter. Shout out to my guy Chauncey Pearl's already in the building. I'm putting down a few bucks on Smith just due to the line, and I do believe Smith is a live dog, and there's a lot of that going on, man. A lot of people are saying Joe Smith Jr. at plus 550 is sitting there as a nice value play. And I wrote the article on CalisBoxing.com, and I'll put it below after the show in the comment section so people can check it out watching this on the archive and see where I think the value plays are. It's tough to find value in this fight, in my opinion, and more on that in a minute. Go ahead and vote on the poll. Excuse me. Hold on. Let me turn that volume down there. Go ahead and vote on the poll on YouTube. It's currently sitting at 50-50 on whether Joe Smith Jr. or Artur Beterbiev will win this fight. And what a fight it is. Fireworks guaranteed. This on paper is a fight. As soon as they announce it, I go, ooh, oh, that's one of those. That's a banger. It's a guaranteed banger. Shout out Omar E in the building, and y'all make sure to hit that like button as y'all come in and leave a comment. Leave comments during the show. Guaranteed banger. Guaranteed. It doesn't matter, like any sport that you watch. If you're knowledgeable, you can look at the schedule ahead and say, that's a guaranteed great event right there. It's guaranteed entertainment, guaranteed fireworks. And this one is one of those. As soon as they announced it, you say, okay, not only is this high entertainment value, but guess what? Both guys have some boxing ability. Both guys top 3 in their division. And oh, by the way, it's a meaningful fight, being that it gets us closer to undisputed. Anything that gets us closer to undisputed is meaningful. It gets us closer to someone cleaning out the division, getting all of the championship belts in their trophy case. And when we have one fighter in a division with all of the belts, meaningful belts in his trophy case, all 4 of the major ones, we have an undisputed champion, and we have a champion in the division. We have that at 135. We got that at 140, although I think Josh Taylor just vacated one of those belts. And we got that at 168 with Canelo. We've got guys who we can say, we can point to that guy and say, Devin Haney is the lightweight champion of the world. That's meaningful. It's important because you can break it down to the casual boxing fans easier. You can say, that's the guy. They can say, this is the guy, this is the guy, this guy. They can say, doesn't mean anything. He's undisputed. He is the guy in the division. And this fight gets us closer to that in the light heavyweight division. It gets us one fight away from undisputed. We got Dimitri Bivol over here. And then we've got these guys over here fighting to consolidate multiple belts. So then we'll have Bivol, and we'll have the winner of Beterbiev, Joe Smith Jr. with all of the belts. And they could fight for undisputed. Whether that fight happens next or not, that's conversation for later on in the show. But first, let's start off with some news that's just breaking. Edgar Berlanga, I just dropped a video on my YouTube page that it looks like he's going to have a 6-month suspension. This was first broke by BoxingScene.com last night, and Mike Coppinger is out there reporting on it as well, that he's looking at a 6-month suspension and $10,000 fine. Now, anybody who follows boxing knows that a 6-month suspension and a $10,000 fine is what? It's this. It's one of these numbers, right? A slap on the wrist. It's just for them to say, hey, we did something here. We did something here. He bit somebody. That's uncalled for. We can't have that. So we're slapping him with a 6-month suspension and a $10,000 fine of his purse. But anybody who knows boxing knows a 6-month suspension isn't a real suspension. It's not really a suspension. It's a vacation because guys stay away for 6 months anyway. Fighters now, you'll be lucky to see them fight twice a year. So Berlanga was likely going to sit out those 6 months anyway. Shout out Haplotype. Oh, in the building, my guy Haplotype. But Berlanga was going to sit out those 6 months anyway. So if he gets a 6-month suspension, if this reporting is true, then it's like a major league starting pitcher who gets suspended 5 games. It's like he wasn't going to play those 5 games anyway. It's a 5-pitcher rotation. So you're suspending him at best 1 game. And with this, it's not even that, because Berlanga can fight again after December 11th, 2022, which he was likely going to do anyway. On top of that, this is only a New York State Athletic Commission suspension. So Berlanga, if he wanted to fight before December 11th, he can go politic to California, Las Vegas, Texas, Puerto Rico, and say, hey, I want to fight. And those guys would say, hey, you bring some value, you bring some fans to the table, we'll let you fight. We're not going to adhere to New York State Athletic Commission's ruling. That wasn't a real bite anyway. You were just rubbing his neck with your teeth. They would do something to slide it under the rug and get a Berlanga fight in their area if Berlanga really wanted to fight before December 11th. Remember, Mike Tyson was suspended by Nevada State Athletic Commission. Guess what? He just never fought in Vegas again after that. He fought in other places. Antonio Margarito was suspended after the Shane Mosley fight by California State Athletic Commission. Guess what he did? He went and fought in Mexico several times. He fought in New York against Cotto. He fought in Texas. He just went elsewhere. And those other places said, we're not going to adhere to that suspension that California slapped on you. We'll let you fight here. You bring money and value to the table. So that's why these suspensions aren't real suspensions. And anybody who follows boxing knows a 6-month suspension isn't a suspension. It's just not. And a $10,000 fine is nothing. It's not. It's just them saying, hey, we did something here. We did something here. We'll wash our hands of it. We did something. There was a bite. We got to do something about it. Is Canelo going back to 175? I believe Canelo is going back to 175 for the Bivol rematch eventually. Canelo saying he still wants to stick to the immediate plan, which is Golovkin in September, likely John Ryder in December, or possibly February, depending on how the Golovkin fight goes. That would be a big fight in the UK. And also, I'm going to circle back. He said he wants to circle back. Eddie Hearn has said this, to the Bivol rematch in May of next year. So I think he does go back to 175 to fight Bivol. I don't think there's anything of value for Canelo to have Bivol come down to 168, which is what Bivol said he'd like to do, to become undisputed at 168 and then come back up to 175 to try to become undisputed there. But I think Canelo really wants to see what happens, how this materializes, see if Bivol does get a shot at undisputed. And if so, we could have undisputed between Bivol and Canelo at 175 in May of next year. But I do think that it hurts Canelo that he lost that fight, and he will eventually circle back to the Bivol fight at 175 in May of next year. I think Beterbiev going to win, and most people agree with you on that. So let's dive into the betting odds. And y'all make sure to hit that like button as y'all come in. Artur Beterbiev is minus 800 going into this fight, which means he's a healthy, very healthy betting favorite. That means you have to bet $800 to win $100 on him. That's not much value in betting Beterbiev straight up. Joe Smith Jr. is plus 550. So those of you who don't know betting odds, that means that you can bet $100 on Joe Smith Jr. and win $550 plus your $100 back. That's what that means. That means that Joe Smith Jr. is a pretty heavy underdog coming in here. Now, why would somebody see value in Joe Smith Jr.? Let's ask that question, and let's try to provide some answers. Joe Smith Jr. has been known as a guy who can pull off upsets in the past. He's done it. Just think of the Bernard Hopkins fight, for example. Was a big underdog going into that fight, and he won. Joe Smith Jr. has pulled off multiple upsets in the past, so he's a guy who has been known to be undervalued by Vegas. Furthermore, if you're looking at a possible scenario in which Joe Smith Jr. can win this fight, here's how it would play out. Artur Beterbiev is 37 years old. He's no spring chicken. He's up there in age. Not too many people commenting on that. He's up there, 37 years old. On top of that, 9-year career, he's only fought 17 times. So he hasn't been very active in his career. Fought twice in 2021, so it's somewhat active compared to today's terms, but hasn't been active throughout his career. On top of that, he's been known as a slow starter. He's notorious for starting slow in fights. So a scenario that could play out, which would favor Joe Smith Jr. here and would give him value at plus 50 would be this. His trainer tells him, look, our strategy here is to go in and jump on Artur Beterbiev, being he's a slow starter. Let's try to land as many shots on him as possible early on in the fight to see if there's some wear on that chin, to see if we can get to that chin. On top of that, let's try to bank some rounds in case this thing drags on and gets to decision. Because the odds on that, will the fight go the distance? Yes, plus 275, no, minus 380. So Vegas is saying basically that this fight is not going to go the distance. On top of that, Vegas is saying the most likely scenario is Beterbiev by stoppage, which is minus 280. And that's by far. That's the most likely scenario. The least likely scenario is Joe Smith Jr. by decision at plus 1100. So Beterbiev by late stoppage is the most likely scenario according to Vegas. They priced the over-under at 8.5, and that's why I don't feel there's much value in these betting odds, because I think that over-under is priced correctly. The reason that over-under is priced correctly, I believe, is there's trends from both fighters going into this fight. Joe Smith Jr., 6 of his last 7 fights have ended 9th round or later. Furthermore, 4 of those 7 fights have come by decision, 2 losses and 2 wins. So that's a trend there. It's a trend of a guy who his fights are going deep into fights. They're either late stoppages or decisions. His only stoppage that was early was a first round stoppage a couple fights ago. But other than that, the other 6 fights were either late decision stoppages or decisions. When it comes to Artur Beterbiev, his last 3 fights, 10th round stoppage, 10th round stoppage, 9th round stoppage. So Vegas is looking at that as these are 2 clear trends coming in. This is the toughest opponent from both guys, at least recently, possibly ever. They both had issues getting rid of guys early in fights. They methodically break their opponents down throughout fights. So Vegas is looking at this as a likely Beterbiev late stoppage type of fight, in which Joe Smith Jr. has success early in the fight, getting to Beterbiev's chin. Beterbiev is a guy who gets hit. He's a hittable guy, as is Joe Smith Jr. So Vegas is looking at this scenario that will likely play out as this. He has success first 3, 4, possibly 5, maybe even 6 rounds, first half of the fight against Beterbiev, where he's getting the Beterbiev's chin. He's possibly winning most of those rounds, if not all. And then there's this moment that always comes in Beterbiev's fights. And if you watch Beterbiev on film, he doesn't stick out much to you, especially early in fights. You're like, oh, this guy, I don't know if he's one of the top fighters in the world. I don't know if he's the best 175 pounders in the world until he hits guys. When he starts to methodically break these guys down, you start to see him wilt. And you say to yourself, if those guys are reacting that way, this guy's got heavy hands. This is a heavy-handed dude for them to be reacting this way, because there comes that moment in the fight where he starts to tag their chin. He's undervalued, underrated as a punch placement guy. So he's landing those shots. He's methodically breaking them down. And they just start to wilt. They just start to wilt away. And you say, man, that dude is a heavy-handed fighter. He's a heavy-handed. You don't get 100% KO percentage against the competition he's been facing if you're not. So when I see this fight play out, I think Joe Smith Jr. is going to look good early in the fight. Joe Smith Jr. is underrated as a puncher as well. 22 KOs and 28 victories. And don't forget, yes, he lost by wide decision against Dmitry Bivol, and there's no harm in that. But he had a moment towards the closing bell of the 10th round where he hurt Bivol. So he can punch. Bivol's arguably the best defensive fighter in the world. Statistically, it's either him or Shakur Stevenson. Statistically, as the best defensive fighters in the world. So you say to yourself, if he can land something meaningful against Bivol, who seems to have a great chin as a great defensive fighter, he's going to land against Beterbiev early in the fight. And I want to see how Beterbiev's chin holds up to that. I'm pretty sure it will hold up well. But what if he starts to get to that chin a little more than we expected early in the fight? Then things get interesting. Things get really interesting. But either way, this is going to heat up early because I do believe Joe Smith Jr. knows all this. I do believe Joe Smith Jr., a guy who has been known to pull off multiple upsets in his career, has been known as an undervalued fighter in his career, will know all of this. And for a guy to pull off multiple upsets, he knows what he needs to do strategically going into fights, and he's going to attempt to execute those things. That's what that tells you. So I think Joe Smith Jr.'s team knows this guy's a slow starter. He's up there in age. Let's jump on him and attack early. And that's what makes me excited about this fight most of all is it's gonna play out the way we think it's gonna play out. A lot of fights don't, but this one is gonna play out that way. Joe Smith Jr. is gonna have his moments early in the fight and catch Beterbiev with a lot of shots. And then things get interesting when Beterbiev flips the script on that. And he catches Joe Smith Jr. with a lot of shots because as each round goes on, Beterbiev is going to land more shots on Joe Smith Jr.'s chin. And I'm interested to see how Joe Smith Jr., his chin, how he reacts to that. And then how Joe Smith Jr.'s fists react to that. Because if this gets into a back and forth in the late stages of the fight, we got a fight of the year fight on our hands here. In the poll right now, who's winning? 9 votes. Beterbiev, 89%. Joe Smith Jr., 11%. And that seems to be where everybody's at as far as this fight goes. When I see the panels that are voting on this fight, when it comes to these websites, it seems to be 90-10 Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr. I'm just more curious as to the people, and I've asked them, the people who have Joe Smith Jr. pulling off these upsets, pulling off the upset on a Saturday night, they keep pointing to the same things. And really, it's an intelligent way to look at it. Beterbiev, slow starter. Beterbiev, 37 years old. Joe Smith Jr., a guy known to pull off upsets. Beterbiev is hittable, as is Joe Smith Jr. So Joe Smith Jr. will be catching Beterbiev with shots early. And there are a lot of people, the people pulling, who are picking the upset here, think that Joe Smith Jr. is going to do it by stoppage, that he's going to get to the chin and he's a harder puncher than people expect. Let's see, get to some comments. Porto Source Central BXO, shout out to you, Sub Calix. I will always be grateful to Smith for knocking Hopkins through the rope, ridding us of his boring punch and hold style. Yeah, I remember that fight. That was shocking at the time. And then Joe Smith Jr. came back and lost the fight after that. And a lot of people at the time, let's go back to that. A lot of people at the time thought that, Bernard Hopkins was just up there in age, which he was, and we'll never see Joe Smith Jr. again. He's just an average fighter. And look at years later where Joe Smith Jr. still is. Unification fight at 175, top 3 guy at 175, and a win here on Saturday leverages him into a big fight. A big fight. There's talks of Yardy being in the picture. There's talks of Buatsi being in the picture. Any of those fights are big. And then, of course, the Bivol rematch would be there for him for all the marbles as well. This will come down to whose chin holds up, Callie, your casual boxing friend homies, and tell them this will be a slobber knock and the action will be lit. Shout out Chauncey Pearls. Definitely appreciate this, man. And this is what I said in my article, first paragraph. Not only is it a great fight for us as boxing fans, it's a fight that brings us entertainment value. It's a fight that gives us skill at the same time because Beterbiev and Joe Smith Jr., although not amongst the great tacticians of this sport, they are undervalued tacticians. They can still give you that. On top of all of that, it's a meaningful fight. It gets us closer to a real champion at 175. right? This gets us one step closer and one fight away from undisputed at 175. The winner of this fight leverages themselves into a big fight with Dmitry Bivol for all the marbles. Whether that fight happens next or after that, they're one fight away from undisputed in the division, and they're legit unified champions in the division. You can't take that away from them ever. Meaningful. On top of that, it's a fight that you can invite your casual friends over. I invited my brother over who doesn't watch boxing, and another friend over who doesn't watch boxing, because I know it's safe. It's one of those safe fights where you know there's going to be blood, there's going to be guts, there's going to be heart, there's going to be a lot of trading of leather. There's going to be two guys in there just trying to hurt the other guy, in there trying to separate their opponent from their senses. And that's what the casuals are attracted to. There are a lot of fights where I'm like, you know what? I just want to watch this alone. That's 99% of fights to me, because I don't want to be explaining to casual fans what's going on. I don't want to be explaining to them who holds these belts and why this guy is trying to set up punches instead of actually punching. I don't want to be trying to explain to the casual fan the sweet science of the sport. It's just too much work. It's too exhausting. But in this fight, it's going to be all action. So there's no need for that. It's an easy one to set up for the casual fan. That guy is trying to hurt that guy. The other guy is trying to hurt him. That's it. That's the name of the game. They both want to knock the other guy out. And oh, by the way, they're both real champions in their division. There are 4 belts in the division, 4 championships. They both hold championships in that division. And this win gets them closer to being the champion in the division. It's an easy one to set up for the casual fan. It's easy. So this is one you can safely invite your casual fan over. A lot of times the lower weight classes give you fights like this, where you say, oh, it's going to be all action. But not everybody, especially the casuals, like watching horse jockeys fight. So these are 2 big guys who can bang, who can knock you out, can stop you through attrition, can knock you out with one punch. It just gives you everything. This fight gives you everything. You better bring your lunch pail if you're going to fight Smith, the hard-working man. And he's a hard-working man. And this is the draw to Joe Smith Jr., right? American fighter. People can relate to the blue-collar story. New York fighter, fighting in New York, fighting against a Russian. You got that angle as well, the Cold War angle, and this will be a hot war, as I stated in the article. But it just gives you a lot of different angles, and Joe Smith Jr. is relatable to a lot of guys. He's relatable to a lot of people. Everybody can relate to the guy who is vulnerable and has a lower ceiling than a lot of people, but continues to exceed your expectations. And like I said, after the Bernard Hopkins victory, a lot of people were saying, oh, Bernard Hopkins is up there in age. Not really a great victory. It's not going to age well. And then he loses the next fight. But then all these years later, he's in a unification fight, main event in New York, being a New York fighter, and one fight away from, if he wins this, fighting for the undisputed championship of the world in a rematch against Dmitry Bivol. But what about the sweet science, bro? Not on this fight. This will be an old school slugfest. That's right. Shout out RM. Salute D Nice. And let's go real quick back to the poll. 82% for Beterbiev, 18% for Joe Smith Jr. As far as who's winning with 11 votes. And I think that's right where it should be. So just to recap the betting odds real quick, Beterbiev is a minus 800 favorite, Joe Smith Jr. plus 550. So Vegas thinks that Beterbiev is going to win this fight by knockout or stoppage late. That's what these odds tell us. Beterbiev minus 280 by knockout. Joe Smith Jr. is plus 1100 by decision. That's wide. Will the fight go the distance? Vegas is saying no. It's not going the distance because it's minus 380 that the fight's not going the distance. And once again, for people who don't know betting odds and gambling, you have to bet $380 in order to win 100 back. So they're saying, Vegas is saying Beterbiev is going to win this by late stoppage. And they're daring you to bet against that. There's even an odds boost on Caesars. And an odds boost is there to tease you. It's saying, just bet this, bet this. And Beterbiev wins in the first 6 rounds is plus 300. I think there's a reason they're teasing us with that. They know that this fight is going to drag on. They know both these guys have great chin. They have attrition. They're both warriors. And once again, the trend that I'll repeat because I think it's worth repeating. The over and under is 8.5 rounds. And the reason the over under is 8.5 rounds in this fight is because there are trends, heavy trends coming into this fight for both fighters. Beterbiev, his last 3 fights, 10th round stoppage, 10th round stoppage, 9th round stoppage. And Vegas believes Joe Smith Jr. is better than those 3 opponents. On top of that, Joe Smith Jr., his last 7 fights, 6 times it went 9 rounds or over. 4 times it was decisions, 2 losses and 2 wins. Only 1 time it was a first round knockout, was the fight stopped before 9 rounds. So you have 2 fighters trending going into this fight whose fights go deep into fights. Both of these fighters. So Vegas sees this fight playing out the same. They think it's going to go deep. They think it's going to go possibly into the championship rounds before someone is stopped, and it's more likely going to be Beterbiev stopping Joe Smith Jr. And I can't disagree with Vegas, which is why I don't find much value in these odds other than possibly putting a little money down on Joe Smith Jr. plus 550. And possibly even playing Joe Smith Jr. by knockout or stoppage plus 900. Just putting a little bit down that you wouldn't lose any sleep over if you lost it. That's possibly the only value I see in this fight. I don't know if it's going to go over under 8.5. It's going to be dicey. It's going to get close. I think that's priced perfectly by Vegas. But I don't see much room to maneuver here. I don't see much value in these odds. But this thing is going to be fun. Oh, it's going to be fun. I have a feeling I know what the result is. To me, this is like a lot of great movies. I know pretty much how it ends. Like when I watch Stranger Things, I know the high school kids, the core high school kids are going to survive, right? But it's the lead up to it, right? It's watching their journey. You know how the journey ends, but you want to watch that journey. You still want to watch the journey go on. To me, this fight is similar. I have a pretty good feeling Beterbiev is going to knock out Joe Smith Jr. late in this fight. Stop him or knock him out. Possibly the referee stopping the fight. Possibly his corner throwing in the towel. Possibly the referee stopping the fight. It could be any of those things. But I feel strongly that Beterbiev is going to win this fight late. But still, I know Joe Smith Jr. is going to have his moments in this fight. And it has me questioning, what if Joe Smith Jr. pulls off another upset here? What if he upsets the apple cart again? Because everybody is expecting Bivol to be number 1 and Beterbiev to be number 2 after this, and to set up an all-Russian showdown for undisputed at 175. And by the way, there are things that likely you know how boxing is. They have to carry the story on, right? They can't just give us the ending. So I'm already hearing reports about Bivol possibly fighting Boazzi. The winner of this fight fighting Yardy. You know, these scenarios in which, by the way, those are good fights. There are plenty of good fights to make at 175. You could also go with Bivol versus Zurdo, another good fight. But you know what's a better fight than all of those? Bivol versus Beterbiev for 175-pound undisputed if Beterbiev wins this fight. In case someone is wondering, it's on ESPN. That's another great thing and bad also, because I'm very frustrated with ESPN's coverage of boxing. I'm very much appreciative that I don't have to pay a pay-per-view cost. It's not behind a paywall. I don't have to pay a subscription for the fight. But ESPN needs to step up their game as far as coverage of fights. If it's a first round knockout or a 12-round decision, the next fight is starting at the same time, and that's frustrating because we have to get multiple Mark Kriegel segments. We got to get the locker room footage, and there's 30 to 45 minutes between fights, and then we don't get to the main event until after midnight Eastern time. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to watch. They should be getting to these main events around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock Eastern time, somewhere in between that time gap, but they're not. So that's frustrating, but it's not behind the pay-per-view paywall. It's not behind the paywall at all. Regular ESPN. Do you see Beterbiev's age play a part in this fight? And I mentioned that at the top. The people who are throwing out the scenario of Joe Smith Jr.'s upset, the people who are picking Joe Smith Jr. by upset, that's one of the factors they continue to throw out. Beterbiev's 37 years old. People are not mentioning that enough. He's up there in age. He's not a spring chicken. On top of that, he's a notorious slow starter in fights. So what if Joe Smith Jr. jumps on him early, lands a lot of big shots, and then the 37-year-old legs don't react as well as they have in the past? That's the scenario that the people throwing out Joe Smith Jr. by upset continue to throw out. And that's why I say, like, why not throw a little bit of money that you can lose without losing any sleep on Joe Smith Jr. plus 550 or possibly Joe Smith Jr. plus 900 by stoppage. It's a wild card. What if Beterbiev ages in this fight? He's no spring chicken. Yep. ESPN commentary team are like the commentary team in the film Dodgeball. ESPN the Ocho. So when did it become a thing to announce the fighters walking to the ring from the locker before the music would come on and the fighters entered the arena? That's it. That's what I'm saying. Like, it's too much Mark Kriegel. It's too much footage of the locker room before the fight and the fighters. It's just too many segments. Just show fights. That's one thing I love about the Zone. It's one thing I love about ESPN UFC. Like, I don't watch much UFC, but it's the same network. I don't understand why it's a difference. So it must be a top rank issue because ESPN, UFC on ESPN, the fight ends, post-fight interview, they're immediately after a commercial racking up the next fight. Ring entrances, and that's it. We get to the next fight. It's seamless. There's flow to their cards. Same thing with the Zone. There's flow there. They'll go to the talking heads for a couple minutes to set up the next fight, and then the next fight starts. ESPN needs to get better at that. I don't understand how they cannot watch the replays of their coverage of fights and see this. They got to see that they need more. They need to streamline this. They need to get better flow to their cards, and they need to start these main events earlier. There's no reason not to. Beterbiev versus Joe Smith Jr. has no competition Saturday night. So it doesn't matter if the fight starts at 10:30 Eastern or midnight Eastern. Why not do it 10:30 Eastern before people are falling asleep on their couch? So that's all I got. But to recap, I like Beterbiev by late stoppage in this fight in a war. This will be a war. I appreciate y'all tuning in.